And Hurricane Irma has claimed 6 more lives. Patients at a nursing home in Florida died after their building lost electricity during the storm. Nearly 80 people have died in total since the storm made landfall in the Caribbean last week. Josephine Shields of the Red Cross is in the capital of Trinidad and Tobago, Port of Spain, and joins us now live. Josephine, good to speak to you. Just how would you currently describe the rescue effort that's ongoing across the Caribbean?
Thank you very much for your interest and for your support. So far, across the Caribbean, we have had very good coordination, both in terms of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent, but also with the government coordinating mechanism in countries, as well as with the interagency coordination system through the UN, as well as through the CDMA coordinating unit for the governments of the member states of CARICOM, and of course, observer members. So generally, the coordination has been going really well. There has been a lot of exchange of information, exchange of ideas, exchange of notes around the affected areas, the different support that are being mobilized by different entities, and also exchanging information in terms of what the plans are based on each agency, each country, as well as each entity's own responsibilities and also capacities.
Now, Josephine, of course, every year there are hurricanes and storms across the Caribbean. It just depends which side of it gets hit. This time it was St. Martin and the other smaller islands. How well prepared were those islands for what was coming? Of course, the forecasting told us it was going to be a big one. How well prepared do you think they were?
I think what I would answer it in 2 different ways. One is that, the International Red Cross and all the Red Cross societies across the entire region, including the associated territories who are branches of the British, American, French, and Netherlands Red Cross. As an organization, we have a very strong history and tradition in working in disaster risk reduction, or we now call it resilience. And we have been working a lot across the different territories with that approach. The UN system as well, and CDMA, which is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, has also been supporting member states to work as well in preparedness. So generally, we could say there has been a lot of investment in preparedness through support from agencies like the Canadian International Development Agency, the Swedish Agency for International Development, the British as well from the UK, and as well from ECHO through the European Commission and European Union. So there has been a lot of investment, and that has really been helping communities to be more aware of what their risks are, be aware of the hazards, be aware as well of what their capacities are to handle these risks and these hazards. Having said that, in the case of Hurricane Irma, as you have seen from the different write-ups, and as you might have also heard in the days leading up to Irma, this was an unprecedented situation. It was a Category 5, which was going to affect very small islands, very small territories, which also have, for the most part, economies which are dependent on coastal areas, and as a result, it was leaving them very open. So in terms of regular preparedness, they had the information, they had taken the necessary steps to prepare themselves. They also had, to a very great extent, invested the limited amount of money they had at their disposal, certainly for the English-speaking Caribbean and the independent territories like Antigua and Barbuda. They have invested quite a lot in terms of preparedness. But their infrastructure would not be able to withstand something like a Category 5, which is actually not something they're used to. So in the face of a Category 5, which was what we got with Irma arriving in and making landfall in these territories, it was hard to handle because, one, the economies are primarily like tourism-based, and so they are based on having the tourists the option to be able to touch their feet into the pristine Caribbean waters within 2 minutes of having left their hotel room, or 5 minutes maximum. So that means that by its very nature of the economy that we have operating in the region, it would make us vulnerable, and that's what we actually faced in. So all things being considered, it was hard to be able to predict that we get a Category 5. It's never happened in the history of the Caribbean region. There's no memory of it, and as such, it was hard to be able to foresee how we could actually make our infrastructure and make our economies and our industries more resilient to something of this magnitude and this ferocity.
Absolutely. I mean, going forward, though, there is the likelihood that these kind of storms may well come again to the Caribbean. We heard from Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, saying that he was going to make sure that St. Martin was rebuilt and rebuilt stronger. What kind of conversations are you guys going to be having with governments across the region to make sure that when they do rebuild, they try and rebuild more resilient buildings that can cope with strong storms that are bound to happen in the future?
Thank you. That definitely is what we have been saying. I mean, it's about recovery, actually looking at not just rebuilding the risk or reconstructing the risk, but about how recovery actually builds back better, builds back in a way where, based on what we've been told through the predictions for and the impact of climate change on the region, which is much more intense natural phenomena, including cyclones, and also looking at how we ensure that when these are happening, we have the infrastructure which actually will be resistant to it. So I think what we have been talking with certainly the government of Antigua and Barbuda so far, we haven't yet gotten to the discussion around what next, because we're still in the early stages. And of course, having had to, towards the end of last week, also prepare for the imminent arrival of, and the feared arrival of Hurricane Jose, then that also limited what we could have done in terms of having an engaged dialogue as we would have done in a regular situation in terms of what the next steps are. Now that conversation is beginning to take place, and we have very clearly, and the government themselves also recognize that, to take care of their people, they have to look at how do they address certain key policy issues in terms of greater land use management planning, greater zonation, etc. But like I said, given the very nature of the Caribbean economies, where given the vulnerability they've been exposed to because of the reduced commodity prices over in the 90s into the early 2000s, when banana and sugarcane were no longer king, so to speak, in the region. So now it's become a very service-oriented economy, and that a lot of that service is related to tourism and tourism product development. So we are also mindful that while we can encourage governments to do more in terms of making their infrastructure much more hurricane and other extreme weather events more resistant to these, it's also that we have a very clear recognition that unless there is a way to substitute the economic situation and practices, it's going to be difficult to actually realistically expect them to actually to do more to actually resist these things. So yeah, I think one of the things we have to also look at is, in addition to the early warning system, we're actually looking to invest more into those. It's also about how do we look at some safer evacuation activities. So how do we ensure that if a Cat 5 is coming and we have done the assessment and we realize that certain structures are not going to be resisting, how do we minimize or reduce completely the loss of life on people by ensuring that they move out and we take the tourists off the island and so on. Of course, that will call for a greater coordination between the governments who are in the territories as well as the governments of whose citizens are actually visiting. And of course, while there's a requirement, for example, for citizens to check in with their embassy and say, hello, I'm on island or I'm in country X, most persons don't do that. So until something bad happens, then the authorities can't really say, I have 200 citizens in this point, we need to get them out with a particular charter. So I think the overall, what has happened and what is a lesson learned for the overall system, international system in general, is that there's need for greater coordination among different governments and also for people as individuals to take greater responsibility for themselves, and also how do they indicate their presence on island to ensure that if there were to be something happening, the embassies and also governments can know that our citizens are there, let's do something to help them to evacuate.
Absolutely.
Because we depend on the regular flight.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we do have to leave there. We've run way over time. Josephine, coordinating the relief effort for the International Committee of the Red Cross from Trinidad. Thank you very much for joining us.